Lance Cooper's heart was racing as he approached his home. The weight of his duffel bag nothing compared to the anticipation in his chest. It had been 3 long years since he'd held Fiona in his arms and seen little Issa's smile. The deployment had been brutal, but thoughts of this moment had kept him going. On the darkest nights, he stopped at the front door and took a deep breath. The familiar scent of jasmine from Fiona's favorite bush wafted through the air, but something else lingered beneath it. Something was off. Lance shook his head, chalking it up to nerves. He turned the key and stepped inside the living room. He looked around. The furniture was in a different arrangement. There were new throw pillows, and everything looked normal after years away. But as Lance looked around, he noticed some things that didn't seem right. There was a man's jacket on a chair and work boots by the door that weren't his size. He called out, but there was no answer. Issa's silence greeted him. Lance moved further into the room. The house felt different somehow. His soldier's instincts were on high alert. The air felt thick and oppressive in the kitchen. There was a half-empty coffee mug on the counter. The scent that had bothered him outside was stronger here. It was cologne, not his. Lance's hands clenched into fists. What the hell was going on? A floorboard creaked behind him. Lance spun around. Lance came face to face with Issa in the hallway. She was frozen, her eyes wide with shock. He smiled, saying, "Baby girl, it's me. I'm home." But instead of rushing into his arms, Issa's face crumpled, and she sank to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks. "No," she whispered. "No, you can't be here. They told us you were dead." Lance felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He took a step toward his daughter, but she flinched away. "Issa, what are you talking about? I'm not dead. I'm right here." Lance grabbed the kitchen counter to steady himself. "Who told you that? I want to know where your mother is." He heard the front door open. Lance heard Fiona's laugh, followed by a deeper chuckle. A man's voice said, "Issa." Lance moved toward the living room. Lance rounded the corner just as Fiona and Warren stepped inside. His wife, his brother, hand in hand. Time seemed to slow. Lance watched as Fiona's smile faded, replaced by shock. Was that fear in her eyes? Warren's face drained of color, his grip on Fiona's hand tightening. "Lance, Fiona," Lance said. "Oh my God," in a low voice. Warren took a half step forward. "We can explain," he said. "We can explain why you're holding my wife's hand, why there's another man all over my house, and why my daughter. Lance, we thought you were killed in action. We mourned you. How long did you wait, Fiona? A week? A month? It wasn't like that. Warren said we were both grieving. It just happened." Lance crossed the room in 2 quick strides and slammed Warren against the wall. "It just happened," he snarled. "You just happened to my wife and steal my life." "Dad, stop," Warren said, his voice cutting through the rage. Lance turned to see his daughter standing in the hallway, her face pale with fear. He'd kindled some of the fire in Lance's veins and released Warren, stepping back. "I need answers," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Fiona sank onto the couch, her hands shaking. "We received word about 18 months ago. They said your unit had been ambushed. There were remains. They matched your DNA." Lance's mind reeled. "That's impossible. I was captured and held as a prisoner, but I'm here now and I'm alive." "We had no way of knowing," Warren said. "If we had any idea you'd be here, you'd know I'd never move into your house or take your place in my daughter's life." Islam made a choke sound. "I don't understand. How can you be here?" she said. "You're buried there. There's a gravestone with your name on it." The weight of her words hit Lance like a physical blow. They had buried him, mourned him, replaced him while he'd been fighting to stay alive, dreaming of this homecoming. His family had moved on without him. "I can't be here," Lance muttered. "I can't. I need to think." He turned and walked towards the bedrooms, needing space and to breathe. He found himself in the master bedroom, which was his bedroom, but it wasn't his anymore. Warren's clothes were in the closet, and his brother's reading glasses were on the nightstand. Lance's chest heaved, and he stumbled into the walk-in closet, sinking to the floor. In the far corner, hidden from view, he allowed himself to take in the full impact of the situation. Everything he'd fought for, everything he'd dreamed of, coming home to it was gone. His wife was in the arms of his own brother, his daughter was confused and afraid of him, and his very identity had been erased and replaced. Voices drifted from Lance, could hear Fiona's muffled sobs. Warren's attempts at comfort, and Law's confused questions. "What are we going to do?" Fiona asked. "I don't know," Warren replied, "but we'll figure it out together." The word echoed in Lance's mind, a knife twisting in his gut. They were a family now. He was an outsider, sitting in the darkness of the closet surrounded by the trappings of the life that should have been his. Lance felt a sharp, cold pain in his chest. The shock and pain crystallized into something colder and sharper. They thought they had buried him, but let them think that the man they knew, the trusting husband and father, was still alive. Lance's husband and doting father was dead. In his place sat a soldier, a survivor, a man with nothing left to lose. Lance's lips curved into a grim smile. They wanted to play happy families, but he'd show them just how badly they'd underestimated him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, as the voices in the living room continued. Lance began to plan how he would make them pay for every false tear, every betrayal, and every moment of happiness they'd stolen from him. He would start by destroying everything they held dear. Lance remained hidden in the closet, his mind racing with plans for revenge. He could hear Fiona and Warren. As night fell, he slipped out, careful to avoid detection. Over the next few days, Lance observed his wife and brother from a distance. He watched as they went about their new life together, seeing how easily Fiona had settled into her role. Lance was filled with a cold rage when he saw Fiona laughing with Warren and sharing intimate moments. One evening, he overheard a conversation between them in the backyard. Fiona said, "We need to talk." Warren replied, "I know, we know, but what do we tell her? The truth is pretty complicated." Fiona scoffed, "That's an understatement. Her father, who she thought was dead, is alive, and he hates us. Can you blame him? Lance was in love, and he wasn't going to lie about it." Their words only made him more determined to make them pay for every moment of happiness they'd stolen from him. The next day, he focused on gathering information. He used his military connections to dig into Fiona and Warren's finances. Lance reached out to an old army buddy, Jake, who now works in private security. Jake was surprised to hear from Lance. Lance said, "I need to know everything about my wife and brother's lives." Jake hesitated. "Lance, are you sure about this? Maybe you should talk to them and try to work things out." "There's nothing to work out." Lance cut him off. "Will you help me or not?" "Okay, Jake. I'll see what I can do. But be careful. Revenge can eat you alive." Lance ignored the warning. Lance had nothing left to lose as the days passed. His plan began to take shape. He would destroy Fiona's reputation first, then shatter Warren's career. They would never know peace again. One afternoon, Lance managed to get Isa alone. She was in the backyard, sitting on the swing he had built for her years ago. "Isa," he called softly. She looked up, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and longing. "Dad, is it really you?" Lance's heart ached at her uncertainty. "It's me, sweetheart. I'm sorry, I scared you before." Ila hesitated, then ran to him. Lance wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. "I don't understand, Isa," she sobbed. "They said you were gone. We had a funeral, and now." "Uncle Warren," Lance pulled back, looking into his daughter's eyes. "I know it's confusing, but I need you to know that I never abandoned you. I fought every day to come back to you, but Mom and Uncle Warren made their choices." Lance said, his voice hardening. "But you're my daughter. Nothing will ever change that." Isa looked torn. "I love Uncle Warren," she admitted quietly. "Hyun's been good to us." Lance felt a stab of jealousy, but he pushed it down. "I understand," he said. "But Isa, you need to know that what they did, it wasn't right. They lied to you, to everyone." Confusion and hurt flickered across. Lance hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything, to turn her against Fiona and Warren completely, but he knew he had to be careful. He couldn't risk alienating Isa. "Just keep your eyes open," he said finally. "Things aren't always what they seem." As Lance continued his investigation, he uncovered there was damning evidence that Fiona and Warren's affair had started before Warren's supposed death. It had been going on for months before his deployment. Lance was furious at the betrayal. He wrote an anonymous letter. His hands were shaking with rage. He wrote, "You thought you buried me, but I'm very much alive. The truth will be revealed soon." He was going to reveal everything soon. He slipped the letter into their mailbox, imagining Fiona's panic when she read it that night. Lance overheard another conversation between Fiona and Warren. They had to tell him the truth. Warren insisted, "We have to tell him the truth." Fiona's voice was frantic. "Are you insane? He'll never forgive us. We'll lose everything. We're losing. Warren argued that if they came clean, stuck to their story, and kept up the pretense that he was dead, it would all blow over. Lance smiled grimly in the darkness, realizing that their lies were already unraveling. The next day, he noticed that Fiona was agitated and jumpy, her eyes constantly darting around. He watched her as she had a heated phone conversation, as if he expected him to appear at any moment. She hissed into the phone, "I don't care what it takes. I need those records buried permanently." "No, you don't understand. If this gets out, I'll lose everything. My daughter, my reputation, everything." Lance's smile was. As time went on, Fiona was starting to realize that Lance was right. He watched her and Warren and saw their perfect lives start to fall apart because of him. One evening, he heard them arguing. Fiona was saying that Warren was to blame for their problems because Lance had pushed them to get married. Warren quickly took the blame. "Rose, you were the one who said we should move into the house. You wanted to play happy families and you were all too happy to step into your brother's shoes." Fiona shot back, their words only confirming what Lance already knew. They were opportunists, willing to build their happiness on the backs of others. Lance's military training came in handy as he gathered more evidence, bank statements showing large withdrawals around the time of his death, emails discussing their relationship long before he was deployed. Everything was falling into place, so he reached out to Jake again. Lance said one more thing. He wanted to know who'd signed off on his death certificate. Jake was a bit hesitant, but he replied, "Lance, are you sure you want to go down this road? Maybe it's time to let it go and start fresh." "There's no starting fresh." Lance interrupted him, saying, "Not until they pay for what they've done. You give me that information or not?" Jake sighed. "I can get it, but be careful. This kind of anger can consume you." Lance knew it was almost time to make his move. He watched as Fiona paced the living room, phone pressed to her ear. "I don't care what you have to do," she hissed. "Find him. He has to be somewhere. No, you listen to me. If Lance goes public with this, we're ruined. Do you understand? Ruined." Warren entered the room, his face. Fiona was clearly distressed. She shook her head, tears in her eyes. Warren said grimly, "He's not a ghost. He's very much alive and he wants revenge." Fiona's voice broke. Warren pulled her into his arms. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We always do." Lance watched from the shadows of anger lingered as they thought they could outsmart him and outmaneuver him. They had no idea what was coming that night as Fiona and Warren slept. In what should have been his bed, Lance made his final preparations for tomorrow. Everything would change tomorrow. They would learn the true meaning of loss. As he stood in the darkness, looking at the house that was no longer his, Lance felt a moment of doubt. Was this really what he wanted to destroy? Not just Fiona and Warren, but potentially his own life as well? But then he remembered the betrayal, the lies, the years stolen from him. His resolve hardened. There was no going back. Tomorrow, Fiona and Warren will learn that actions have consequences. Those consequences are about to come crashing down on their perfect little world. The night air was thick with tension as Lance crouched in the shadows of the house he once called home. His muscles were coiled, ready for action. It was time for he'd been watching and waiting for long enough. Tonight he was going to reclaim what was rightfully his. Through the window he could see Fiona and Warren in the living room. They were arguing again. Their voices carried through the thin glass. "We can't keep living like this," Fiona said. "He's out there," Warren replied, "watching us, planning, God knows what." Warren ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident on his face. "What do you want me to do, Fiona? He's my brother. We can't just ignore him. We can't pretend he doesn't exist. That's exactly what we need to do. We have a life here, a family. We can't let him destroy that." Lance's jaw clenched. Family. As if they, after everything they've done, he thought, watching Warren pace the room. "Maybe we should just tell him the truth about everything." Fiona's eyes widened in panic. "Are you insane? He'd kill us both. We don't know that." Warren countered that he's still my brother. "If we explain what?" She said we were screwing behind his back long before he died, that we were relieved when we got the news because it meant we could finally be together. Oh, I'm sure he'd take that well. Lance was really angry at her words. All the suspicions and fears he'd had were confirmed in that moment. They hadn't just moved on after his supposed death. They had wanted him gone. He'd heard enough. It was time to end this. Lance moved silently to the front door, took a deep breath, and steeled himself for what was to come. Then, with a forceful kick, he burst into the house and slammed the door against the wall with a thunderous Fiona screamed and stumbled back. Warren spun around, his face drained of color as he saw Lance standing in the doorway. "Honey, I'm home," Lance said, his voice dripping with venom. "For a moment, no one move," Warren said, his voice thick with tension. The air crackled with tension like the calm before a storm. Fiona was the first to break the silence. She whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, we can explain." "We'll explain." Lance's laugh was harsh and devoid of humor. "Oh, I think I've heard enough explanations. In fact, I just heard a very interesting one through the window." Warren took a step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Brother, please, let's talk about this." Lance moved with incredible speed, like a bolt of lightning. He had been pinned against the wall, with his forearm pressed against his brother's throat. "Don't you dare call me brother," Lance snarled. "Brothers don't steal each other's wives. They don't take over their lives and pretend they never existed. We thought you were." Lance was holding Warren down and choking him. Warren was struggling, but Lance was stronger. Warren was so upset about it, weren't you? So devastated that you just had to get involved. "Lance, stop," Fiona cried out. "You're going to kill him." Lance turned his head to look at her. His eyes were blazing with fury. "Like you killed. Lance, do you have any idea what I went through? It was hell, thinking of you and waiting for me." Fiona's face crumpled. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "We never meant for this to happen. We thought you'd think what Lance demanded, that you could just erase me and replace me with my own brother and live happily ever after." Lance let Warren go and he slumped to the floor, gasping for air. He turned his full attention to Fiona. "How long have you been going behind my back?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Fiona's eyes darted to Warren, then back to Lance. "It doesn't matter now. We can't change the past," she said. "Fiona's arm, how long?" 6 months. Warren was on the floor before your last deployment. We never meant for it to happen. It just happened," Lance finished, his voice dripping with disgust. "Funny how betrayal always just happens, isn't it?" He released Fiona's arm, pushing her away. She stumbled, catching herself on. Lance said, his voice suddenly quiet, "I fought so hard to come back to you, to our family. I endured torture, starvation, things you couldn't even imagine. And for what? To find out that my wife and my brother were glad I was gone." Fiona's face crumpled. "That's not true," she whispered. "We're really sorry about this, Lance. We did try to save it." Lance spat. "I heard you earlier. You were relieved when you got the news. Remember. Finally free to be together without pesky old Lance in the way." Warren struggled to his feet. "Lance, we made a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. But we can't change the past. We have to. Think about the future and about law." When he heard his daughter's name, Lance's eyes flashed dangerously. "Don't you dare bring her into this. You've already poisoned her against me enough." "We haven't started yet, Fiona," Lance interrupted her. "You told her I was dead," he roared. "You let her mourn me. Let her think you left her alone while you pretended everything was fine with my brother. How is that not poisoning her?" The sound of footsteps on the stairs made them all freeze for a moment. Issa appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "What's going on?" she asked. Her voice was small. I heard shouting. Lance's anger deflated slightly at the sight of her. When he saw his daughter, he took a deep breath and tried to calm down. "Issa," he said, his voice gentler now. "I'm sorry. We worked you, your mother and uncle, and I were just discussing some things." Ila's eyes moved between the three adults, taking in Fiona's tear-stained face, Warren's bruised neck, and Lance's clenched fist. "Are you fighting because of me?" she asked, her lower lip trembling. "No, sweetheart," Fiona replied quickly, moving to embrace her daughter. "This isn't about you at all." Lance watched as Fiona comforted Alaw, feeling a fresh wave of anger that should be his. He should be the one comforting his daughter, not the woman who had betrayed him so thoroughly. "Issa," he said, his voice steady, "I need you to go pack a bag. We're leaving." "Lance, I'm going to have to cut her off. She's my daughter, and I'm not leaving her here with you two for another minute." Warren stepped forward. "Lance, be reasonable. You can't just take her in the middle of the night. We need to discuss this and come to a custody arrangement." Lance's laugh was bitter. "Custody arrangement? You're not her father, Warren. You're the man who helped destroy her family. You don't get a say in this. Issa looked between them all, confusion and fear in her eyes, wearing on her face. Dad, what's going on? Where are we going? Lance softened his voice as he addressed his daughter. We're going to start over, sweetheart. Just you and me, away from all of this. But what about Mom and Uncle Warren? Issa's voice wavered. Lance's jaw clenched. They made their choice a long time ago. Now it's time for us to make ours. Fiona clutched his tie. You can't do this, Lance. She has a life here. Friend's school, a life built on lies, Lance interrupted. Is that what you want for her, Fiona? To grow up thinking it's okay to betray the people who love you? Warren tried again. Lance, please, we can work this out for Islaw's sake. Lance's patience snapped in 2 quick strides. He crossed the room and landed a solid punch to Warren's jaw. His brother stumbled back, blood trickling from his split lip. Lance, Fiona screamed, pulling him behind her. Lance stood over Warren, his fists clenched at his sides. That's what's taking me. He growled and then hit Warren again, doubling him over. That's for my wife. Issa's sobs filled the room. Stop it. Please just stop. The sound of his daughter's distress pierced through Lance's rage. He stepped back, breathing heavily. Issa, go pack your bag now, he said, his voice rough. Go on, sweetie, Fiona said, tears streaming down her face. It'll be okay, I promise. Issa went upstairs. Lance turned back to Fiona and Warren. You two have exactly 10 minutes to say your goodbyes. After that, we're leaving. If you try to stop us, I'll regret it. The next 10 minutes passed in a blur of tears and hushed conversations. Lance stood by the door, watching as Fiona hugged Issa tightly. She whispered words of love and reassurance. Warren was still nursing his injuries. He kneeled down to Elle's level, promising her that Lance felt a pang of guilt at the pain in his daughter's eyes, but he pushed it aside. This was for the best. He couldn't trust Fiona and Warren to raise her, not after what they'd done. Finally, it was time to go. He took Elle's hand and led her towards the door. He paused, turning back to face Fiona and Warren one last time. I hope it was worth it, he said, his voice cold. I hope destroying our family was worth a few cheap thrills. Lance's face crumpled. Please don't do this. We can work something out for his sake. You should have thought about that before you got involved with my brother. Lance cut her off. It's too late for that now. He turned to Warren, who was leaning against the wall. His face was a mask of guilt and regret. You're no brother of mine, Lance said, his voice low and dangerous. If I ever see you near my daughter again, I'll finish what I started tonight. Lance walked out the door with Issa's small hand clutched tightly in his. Behind him, he could hear Fiona's muffled sobs and Warren's attempts at comfort as they got into Lance's car. Issa turned to look back at the house. Dad, she said, her voice small. Are we ever coming back? Lance started the engine, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. No, sweetheart, he said firmly. We're not coming back. We're starting over. Just you and me. They drove away from the house that was no longer their home. Lance felt a range of emotions as they drove away from the house that was no longer his. Anger, hurt, and betrayal were still there, but there was also a sense of freedom and possibilities. He glanced at Issa in the rearview mirror and saw that she was looking out the window, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. Lance's heart ached for her, for the pain and confusion she must be feeling. But he knew deep down that this was the right choice. He would protect her, guide her, and give her the life she deserved. As the lights of their old neighborhood faded behind them, Lance allowed himself a small, grim smile. Fiona and Warren had taken everything from him, his home, his family, years of his life. But not anymore. He had taken back control. He had his daughter and a future stretching out before them. It wouldn't be easy. There would be legal battles ahead, no doubt. Fiona wouldn't give up without a fight, but Lance was prepared for that. He had proof of their affair and the lies they'd told. He'd use every tool at his disposal to keep his daughter with him. Forgiveness wasn't an option. Some betrayals are too deep, leaving scars that never heal. Fiona and Warren had made their choice. Now they'd have to live with the consequences. The road ahead was dark and unknown, but for the first time in years, Lance felt a sense of purpose and direction. He'd survived hell till he went back to his family, and though they looked different now than he had imagined, he would fight with everything he had to protect what was left of it. Where are we going? Issa asked. Her voice was small in the dark. Lance reached back, squeezing her hand gently. Somewhere new, he said. Somewhere we can start over. Just you and me, kiddo. We're going to be okay as the miles tick by. Lance felt the weight of the past few years begin to lift. He was still angry, but it didn't control him anymore. He had a new mission, to be the father Issa deserved, and to give her the stable, loving home she needed. Fiona and Warren had taken years from him. He'd betrayed him in the worst possible way, but they hadn't broken him. He was a Lance Cooper soldier, a survivor, a father, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The night stretched out before them, full of uncertainty, but also possibility. As they drove towards their new future, Lance made a silent promise to himself that he would never let anyone hurt his family again. He would protect what was his, no matter what it took or who he had to fight. The road ahead was long and unknown, but for the first time in years, Lance felt ready to face it with Elaw by his side. He could take on anything. The worst was behind them now. It was time to look forward and build something new from the ashes of betrayal. Lance looked back at Issa one last time. She was fast asleep, her face peaceful in the glow of the dashboard lights. Looking at her, Lance felt a surge of love and protectiveness. They had a long road ahead, but they would face it together. As the first light of dawn began to streak the sky, Lance allowed himself a small smile. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He was back, and this time, nothing and no one would stand in his way.